Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a question that's like as old as time itself, the origin of life. Like, how in the world did we go from non-living matter to actual living organisms?
It's a question that has fascinated scientists and philosophers for centuries.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And to help us kind of unravel this mystery, we've got some excerpts from this book, The Origin of Life, from non-living to living beings.
It's a fascinating read, packed with cutting-edge research and some mind-blowing theories.
Totally. Okay, so before we dive into the nitty-gritty, I want to just drop this crazy fact on you. Did you know that your DNA, the stuff that makes you, is about 60% similar to a banana's?
It's true. And it all points back to this idea of shared ancestry, the fact that every living thing on Earth can trace its lineage back to a single common ancestor.
Mind-blowing, right. And that ancestor, way back in time, is what scientists call LUCA, the last universal common ancestor.
LUCA wasn't the first life form, but it's the last common ancestor that all life on Earth today, everything from bacteria to blue whales, redwoods to you listening right now, can trace its lineage back to.
It's like finding out you're related to royalty, except it's like the royalty of the entire planet. But here's the thing. How did LUCA itself come to be? How did we go from rocks and water and stuff to a living, breathing, replicating organism?
That's the million-dollar question. And for centuries, the prevailing idea was that life arose thanks to this mysterious life force that existed only in living things. Kind of like a magical spark that animated the inanimate.
Right, like some kind of supernatural energy that just zapped life. But as scientists started doing experiments, they started to kind of poke holes in this idea.
Exactly. Like in the 1780s, Lavoisier did this really interesting experiment where he compared the heat and carbon dioxide output of a guinea pig to a piece of burning coal.
So he was measuring how much energy they were each producing.
Exactly. And his conclusion was that life was more like a chemical process, like burning, rather than some mystical force.
So even though he wasn't specifically studying the origin of life, his work kind of shifted the thinking away from the supernatural,
Absolutely. It paved the way for a more scientific, more chemical understanding of life.
And then there's Wöhler in 1828. He accidentally created urea, that stuff in pee in a lab.
He synthesized it from inorganic compounds, which is a huge deal because it meant that something found in living things could be made from non-living stuff.
Whoa! It's like blurring the lines between the living and non-living. Okay, so we're starting to see that life might not be so mystical after all, right? But then the big question, what exactly is life?
Defining life is surprisingly complex. There are literally over 100 different definitions out there.
Seriously?
The book mentions over 123. But most scientists agree that life is basically self-reproduction with variations.
So it's not just about existing, it's about creating more of yourself and changing and adapting over time. Makes sense. But how do we go from non-living matter to something that can actually replicate itself?
To answer that, we need to understand what makes life distinct. The book breaks it down into 4 key criteria: complexity, metabolism, having some kind of boundary, and of course, being able to reproduce or replicate.
Okay, so let's start with complexity. Life is made up of all these crazy complex molecules like DNA, but how did those molecules even come about in the first place? Did they just magically appear on Earth?
Well, there's this theory called panspermia, which suggests that the building blocks of life actually came from outer space. Imagine comets and meteorites carrying these complex molecules crash landing on early Earth.
Wait, are we talking aliens seeding life on Earth? Because that's a whole other can of worms.
Not necessarily aliens. But the idea that the ingredients for life could be scattered throughout the universe, that's pretty amazing, right? And there's actual scientific evidence to support this theory. Scientists have used spectroscopy to analyze light from stars, and they found that lots of the building blocks of life, like amino acids, are actually floating around out there in space.
And we've got meteorites like that one that landed in Australia, the Murchison meteorite.
Right. It was packed with amino acids, over 20 different kinds. And even more interesting, they found molecules with something called chirality, meaning they exist in both left-handed and right-handed forms. Life on Earth only uses left-handed amino acids, so finding them in a meteorite is pretty significant.
It's like a cosmic clue that the ingredients for life are out there.
Okay, so let's say these building blocks did rain down on Earth from space. What happened next? How did they go from just being molecules to something resembling life?
Well, that's where the primordial soup hypothesis comes in. Picture early Earth. Shallow ponds filled with a mix of inorganic molecules. Now add in some volcanic heat, lightning strikes, and a dash of UV radiation from the sun.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, maybe not. The Miller-Urey experiment in 1953 actually tried to recreate these conditions in the lab. They took a flask, filled it with water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, the gases they thought were present in early Earth's atmosphere, and zapped it with electricity to simulate lightning. And what happened? Did they create life in a bottle?
Not exactly. But they did create amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and that was huge because it showed that the stuff of life could arise from non-living matter under the right conditions.
That is huge. Okay, so we've got these complex molecules, maybe from space, maybe formed right here on Earth, but how do they go from just floating around to forming something more organized, more like a cell?
That's where things get even more interesting. Some scientists think that clay might have played a crucial role. Like, think of clay as this giant magnet attracting and concentrating those organic molecules floating around in the primordial soup.
So clay is like the organizer, bringing everything together.
Yeah, and not only that, but the structure of clay, with all its little spaces and charged surfaces, could have helped those molecules link up and form even more complex structures. Some even think clay could have helped form the first RNA molecules.
Okay, we got to talk about RNA. I know it's related to DNA, but what makes it so important in the story of life?
Well, think of DNA as like the instruction manual of a cell. It contains all the genetic info, but it needs helpers to actually carry out those instructions. RNA, on the other hand, it can do it all. It can store genetic info, and it can act like an enzyme, which speeds up chemical reactions.
So RNA is like the multitasker of the cell. So are you saying RNA might have been the first self-replicating molecule?
That's the idea behind the RNA world hypothesis. It's still a mystery how that first self-replicating RNA molecule came about, but scientists have shown that it's possible to create RNA from simple molecules in a lab.
This is incredible. We've gone from stardust to RNA and a primordial soup. We're getting close to life as we know it, but there's still one thing missing, right? We still don't have an actual cell.
You're absolutely right. We've got the ingredients, but they need a container, a way to separate the living thing from its surroundings. And that's where things get really wild.
All right, so last time we were talking about like the very beginnings of life, those early molecules and RNA and all that. But how do we go from like molecules in a soup to, actual cells?
That's the question, isn't it? And it all comes down to those lipids, those fatty molecules. Remember, they don't really like to mix with water.
Like oil and water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the key here. Lipids can actually form these tiny bubbles in water, kind of like soap bubbles.
So like little spheres with a membrane, a boundary between inside and outside.
Got it. And if you imagine those bubbles forming in that primordial soup, trapping some of those other molecules like RNA inside, well, that's starting to look a lot like a very, very simple cell.
Like a protocell, right? That's what the book calls them.
Exactly. Protocells. They're not quite full-fledged cells, but they're getting there. They have a boundary. They might have some genetic information inside, and they're separated from the outside world.
Okay, so we've got these little protocells bumping around in the primordial soup. What happens next?
Well, they're not just sitting there. They're interacting with their environment. Some of them might have stumbled upon a way to take in nutrients, using them for building blocks and spitting out waste products. That's like the very first inkling of metabolism.
So they're figuring out how to fuel themselves.
Exactly. And as they're multiplying, they're also competing for those resources. So some protocells might have developed ways to protect themselves to avoid being absorbed or eaten by others.
Wait, eaten? Are you saying there was already predation going on back then?
Well, it's hard to imagine, but yeah, even at that early stage, there was likely some competition, some struggle for survival. And that struggle, that's a driving force behind evolution. It pushes things to become more complex, more diverse.
So from those simple beginnings, things start to get more and more interesting. But how do we go from those protocells to the kind of cells we have today?
Okay, so to understand that, we need to talk about two main types of cells: prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotes, like bacteria and archaea, those are the simpler ones. They're single-celled, and they don't have a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles.
And eukaryotes, those are like us.
Exactly. Eukaryotes are more complex. They have a nucleus where their DNA is stored, and they have all these other specialized structures inside them, like mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell.
And everything from amoebas to plants and animals, those are all eukaryotes, right?
That's right. But here's the question. How do we go from those simple prokaryotes to the more complex eukaryotes?
Yeah, that seems like a big jump.
It is. And one of the coolest theories in biology explains it: endosymbiosis. Imagine billions of years ago, you have this free-living bacteria, really good at making energy. And then you have this archaea, another single-celled organism. And somehow, that bacteria ends up inside the archaea.
So like one cell swallowed another.
Yeah, something like that. Maybe it got engulfed, maybe it snuck in. But instead of being digested, it stuck around. It struck up a partnership.
Whoa, so instead of like lunchtime, it was more like, let's team up.
Haha, exactly. And over time, that bacteria, it became an indispensable part of the archaea, evolving into what we now know as mitochondria, the powerhouses of our cells.
So basically, our cells are like a mashup of two different life forms that decided to join forces billions of years ago.
It's mind-blowing, right? That ancient merger, it changed everything. It gave those early eukaryotes a huge energy boost, allowed them to become more complex, develop new functions, and eventually led to the evolution of all the multicellular life we see today.
I'm like trying to picture it. So that one chance encounter, that partnership, that's what made complex life possible.
That's the idea. It makes you wonder, if it happened once, could it have happened multiple times? Could our cells be even more of a mosaic than we realize?
Good question. But wait, what's the evidence for this whole endosymbiosis theory? It sounds amazing, but how do we know it actually happened?
That's where the detective work comes in. One of the coolest pieces of evidence comes from mitochondria themselves. They actually have their own DNA, separate from the DNA in the cell's nucleus.
Their own DNA? What, like a little ID card proving they used to be independent?
Pretty much. And that mitochondrial DNA is surprisingly similar to the DNA found in certain bacteria. Plus, mitochondria have a double membrane, just like bacteria, and they reproduce on their own inside the cell.
So all these clues point back to that ancient merger. Wow, this is like a detective story, piecing together the history of life from billions of years ago. We've come a long way, from stardust to protocells to these complex eukaryotic cells.
It's an amazing story, and it's not over yet. We're ready for the next chapter. How did those single-celled eukaryotes make the leap to multicellular life? That's where things get really exciting.
So last time we were like totally geeking out about endosymbiosis and how these two single-celled organisms got together and like revolutionized life. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around how we get from even like complex single cells to like, trees and animals and us. It seems like a huge jump.
It is a huge jump. Going from single cells to multicellular organisms is one of the most remarkable transitions in the history of life.
Yeah. Right. But like, where do you even start? How do cells just decide to like team up and form like a whole organism?
Well, think about those early eukaryotic cells, with their mitochondria and all that extra energy.
Yeah, they were like ready to party.
Exactly. They had the energy to try new things, to experiment. So imagine some of those cells bumping into each other, maybe sticking together instead of just like floating apart.
Kind of like what? Forming little clumps, like colonies of bacteria?
Yeah, something like that. And over time, some of those cells within the colony might start to specialize, taking on different roles.
Like a division of labor.
Exactly. Some cells might have become better at absorbing nutrients, others at providing structure, others at sensing the environment.
So instead of every cell fending for itself, they're starting to work together.
Right. It's like a team, each member contributing something unique, something essential. And as those specialized cells become more interdependent, well, you start to see the emergence of tissues, organs, and eventually whole organisms with distinct forms and functions.
Whoa, it's like from a bunch of individual players to a whole orchestra.
I like that analogy. And that specialization, that division of labor, that's what allows multicellular organisms to do all the amazing things they do. It's what allows plants to grow tall, animals to move and hunt, and us humans to have these big brains capable of pondering, the very origins of life itself.
That's incredible. So we've gone from stardust to molecules to single cells to whole organisms. It's mind-blowing. It's like we're not just connected to each other, we're connected to every living thing that's ever existed.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? And it goes even deeper than that. Remember, the building blocks of life, those carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms, all that stuff, it was all forged in the hearts of stars billions of years ago.
Wait, so you're saying we're literally made of stardust?
We are stardust. Every atom in our bodies and every living thing, it came from those ancient stars. And that, I think, is one of the most beautiful and awe-inspiring discoveries of science.
It's poetic, It makes you look at the night sky totally differently. Those stars aren't just distant points of light. They're the source of, everything.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, if the ingredients for life are scattered throughout the universe, could this incredible journey from non-living to living have happened elsewhere? Could there be other planets out there teeming with life? Maybe even more diverse and wondrous than we can imagine.
Okay, now my mind is officially blown. Like, other planets with life? That would be incredible. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface of exploring our own solar system, let alone the entire universe.
And who knows what incredible life forms might be out there waiting to be discovered.
Well, I think it's safe to say that this deep dive has left us with a lot to think about. Like the sheer scale of it all, the interconnectedness of life, and the mind-blowing possibility that we're not alone in the universe.
It's a journey that never really ends, right? There's always more to discover, more to learn, and that's what makes science so exciting.
I totally agree. To everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this epic adventure. We hope you enjoyed exploring the origins of life with us. Keep those questions coming and keep looking up at those stars with a sense of wonder.